Hello there and welcome to our L24 special coverage of the Ukraine-Russia war, the so-called special military operation. Zelensky said his diplomats have sent data about the attack on a prison in Olenivka to the UN and repeated calls for Russia to be recognized as a state of sponsor of terrorism. Officials in the breakaway Donetsk republics accused Ukraine of attacking the facility, but Kiev denied any involvement and said that Russia was destroying evidence of torture of prisoners. On the other side, grain shipments from Ukraine ports on the Black Sea could restart very soon. Ukraine says it is ready to resume exporting grain as part of the UN brokered deal once the routes for vessels leaving its ports are confirmed. More than 20 million tons of grain have been stuck in Ukraine since Russia's invasion in February. To analyze all this information, I'm joined live by Mr. Volodymyr Solovian, political scientist, the new geopolitical research network from Ukraine, Mr. Mark Law, geopolitical analyst and a member of advisory board at Pyramid Timmy Group from Italy. Gentlemen, thank you so much for accepting the invitation to this debate. This discussion begins right after this break. And before we delve into our discussion, let's start with this piece of information. 17 ships ready to move goods from ports in Odessa. A total of 580 tons of grain will be exported for the first time since the start of the Russian-Ukraine conflict after last week's Turkey and the United Nations breakthrough agreement.
President Volodymyr Zelensky visited one of Ukraine's main Black Sea ports in Odessa region on Friday, a week after a deal was struck with Russia, Turkey and the United Nations to create safe corridors for ships to export grains that have been trapped in the country since the start of the Russian special military operation in Ukraine.
The first vessel, the first ship, is being loaded since the beginning of the war. This is a Turkish ship, and I am standing in its background. This indicates that the port has started working. The most important thing for us is that the port and people work. You see that many people, I will say frankly, that everyone is happy, that they went to work and have a job, that the process has started.
As the Battle of Donbass continue, Russia and Ukraine accused each other Friday of shelling a prison in the separatist region of eastern Ukraine, an attack that reportedly killed dozens of Ukrainian military prisoners who were captured after the fall of the southern port city in May. Kiev called for the United Nations and the Red Cross to be allowed to investigate the deaths of the Ukrainian prisoners of war and called for Russia to be recognized as a state sponsor of terrorism.
I would add for myself that there should be a clear legal recognition of Russia as state sponsoring terrorism. I am especially turning to the United States of America. A decision is needed. It is needed now. Russia has proven by numerous terrorist acts that it is the largest source of terrorism in today's world. This is a fact.
The attack was condemned by European Union's Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell on Friday, calling for a stop for the atrocities committed by the Russian armed forces. As the Moscow-installed military administration ruling confirmed their plans of holding a referendum on joining Russia in Ukraine's Kherson region, the UK Ministry of Defense, in its daily intelligence report, claimed that the referendum would be conducted by autumn 2022. It's worth recalling that Kherson, an important port on the Black Sea, has been fully under Russian control since early March, just weeks after Moscow launched its special military operation.
Mr. Volodymyr, since you are in Ukraine, I'll be starting with you. Looking in the battlegrounds map, it is clearly seen that the main focus of the clash in Ukraine now is in the eastern part of the country. And Even that Russia is also putting more power over the southern side as well. Russian troops are claiming taking a full control of the old regions over there, but Ukraine keeps denying. So what is close to be true? And what about the story of the prisoners on Olenivka?
Yeah, we are now on the brink of the next phase of the Russian-Ukrainian war. And I think that we are witnessing redeployments of Russian forces, especially from several directions on the Donbas region to the south, where there is quite a fragile situation for Russians because Ukraine is also preparing its counteroffensive operations. And the main target for Russians at this stage of war is to secure their positions, their stronghold around Kherson, because this is quite fragile territories for them. Since Ukraine whipped out two bridges, one railroad bridge and one big Antonivsky bridge, and that means that supplies became a big challenge for Russian command to maintain their units. And since last several days, they're redeployed to Kherson direction at least 5 or even 7 battalion tactic groups. Mm-hmm. That means that during this, let's say about the third phase of the war, Russians will try to undermine Ukrainians' attempts to provide counteroffensive operations on the Kherson region, and definitely they will try to provide another offensive operations in Donbas region, especially because it is their main political goal. Mm-hmm. And Kremlin cannot solve to their population unsuccessful developments in Donbas, especially. So their main purpose is to bring their reserves that they were accumulating during the summer and make some advances in Donbas and secure their positions in Kherson region. And maybe after that, there are some rumors that Kremlin will attempt to organize so-called referendums in occupied regions of Ukrainian south and as well as Donbas.
Mm-hmm. Perfectly understood. What about the story of the prisoners? Which narrative is close to be true, the Russian one or that one of Donetsk Republic?
Yes, the official Russian information about that is that Ukrainian command decided to shoot Ukraine prisoners of war. And I think that is fully fairy tale and another example of Russian propaganda, because there were no purpose for Ukrainian command to hit this camp, where Ukrainian prisoners of war, defenders of Azovstal, and those who are really heroes for Ukrainians, to kill them. From another perspective, Russians cannot execute them because it will provoke a huge scandal in international organizations, and that is why, from my perspective, Russians could target this camp, concentration camp, where captivities of the Ukrainian soldiers are kept, and sell for their own population as a crime of Ukrainian command. But obviously, we are witnessing no things that, for example, HIMARSs were used to target this camp. But even if Russia brings some debris of HIMARS rockets, that means nothing, because Ukraine use this weapon, MLRS systems, which were shipped to Ukraine from West at least 1 month, and there are many debris of such rockets near Russians' positions, so they could just bring them from another parts of the front and attempt to organize such a provocation.
Thank you.
There is no official statements, and there are many different versions of what could happen, but for me it's obviously a provocation of Russians and their attempt to undermine
The Ukrainian side.
Ukrainians' resilience here and to provoke disgrace among Ukrainian population and undermine positions of President Zelensky, because it was his order to stop surrendering in Azovstal, and it was also under guarantees of international organizations such as United Nations and Red Cross, under such guarantees,
we'll come to this point, Mr. Volodymyr. Thank you so much. Coming to Mr. Mark, don't you think now the war is taking another phase? It's the war of the whole continent. And to stop Russia from more advancement, other countries might and probably must join this war. Majority of the Western European countries indirectly joined this war, but so far they have failed. Don't you think a direct confrontation is inevitable to come over this war?
I don't, basically. I don't think that there is any desire anywhere for any direct involvement in the conflict. If we take a look at the various European nations, because right now we're speaking specifically about the European nations, there will be a continued support in terms of supplying arms and munitions, but any prospect, any idea of being involved physically in the conflict, certainly for the time being, is absolutely out of the question, and I would think extremely unlikely at any point in the future.
Mm-hmm. Perfect, understood. Now, let's move to another point to be discussed. The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on Friday held talks for the first time since the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine. U.S. Secretary said he would urge Russia to honor the landmark deal reached last week in Turkey to allow the release of millions of tons of Ukrainian grain.
Take the phone. I'll also raise the matter of the tentative deal on grain exports that Ukraine, Russia, Turkey, and the United Nations reached last week. We hope this deal will swiftly lead to Ukrainian grain being shipped again through the Black Sea, and that Russia will follow through on its pledge to allow those ships to pass.
So, Mark, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said, I emphasize that the world expects Russia to fulfill its commitment under the deal it reached with Ukraine, Turkey, and the United Nations on grain shipments from Ukraine. At the same time, he said that we will not recognize any annexations of Ukraine territories by the Russians. So, to this point, do you think that Moscow would stop the grain shipments deal at any time, as Blinken assumed?
Well, okay. There are a number of aspects to this. First and foremost, the deal was made on the 22nd of July, if I remember correctly. We're starting to see a series of ships being loaded. We have not as yet seen any ships leaving the ports. So it's also an issue of the safety and the security of the vessels and the seafarers. The issue of demining has not gone away. There is still an issue of having to create robustly secure corridors for the vessels to pass through in order to export any goods at all. Now, that's going to take time. The very, very best, it will take weeks and weeks. So any availability of secure corridors probably will not be a reality until the end of August. Okay. In the meantime, Russia has been losing credibility on all fronts for a long, long time. It's very, very difficult to take any statements seriously. So Russian activities will be scrutinized 24 hours a day over the coming period. Russia also knows that its credibility in certain parts of the world is at risk. Let's think about, for example, the Russian presence in Africa. Now, we know perfectly well that there are a number of African countries that depend enormously on grain, for example, coming out of both Russia and Ukraine. Russia is now in a position to render the situation in countries such as Egypt or Somalia, just to cite the first two that come to mind, they're in a position to render the situation a little more tolerable. So they are in a situation whereby they can assist leadership in these countries to avoid any risk of civil unrest or similar. So Russia will definitely also consider its credibility when deciding what to do and what not to do.
Joyce, Mr. Solovian, will Russia honor the deal as Blinken urged Lavrov to do so, or there will be obstacles to fulfill this requirement? Last time Russia said that Ukraine didn't respect the agreements they have reached. What about this time and this deal?
Well, I think that for the West, especially for United States and Turkey, it is very important to come to mutual understanding whether Russia will fulfill these agreements, because only a day after these grain agreements were signed in Istanbul, we was witnessing a Russian missile attack on port of Odessa, while this port is one of three Ukrainian ports which were part of this agreement, and where from these caravans of vessels will pass their safe passage. So for Ukraine, the main purpose is to keep safe our territorial waters, and there will be no demining except what was and what will be agreed in under the framework of this format. But I would like to also to emphasize that Ukraine didn't sign any agreement, any direct document with Russians. All the documents were signed with the United Nations and Turkey as the mediators of this process. And obviously the signing of such an agreement is our Ukrainian will to be a guarantor of food supplies and food security globally. So that doesn't mean that we will reach any agreement on ceasefire with Russians, because Russians do not want to stop their language of ultimatums, and until Ukraine will whip out Russians from south, at least there will be no perspective for peaceful agreements.
Perfect. Coming to you, Mr. Mark, how can you explain the efforts made so far by Turkish government to release the grain shipments in the Black Sea, and why there isn't another country could have done the same as Turkey? I mean, what is special about its position in this war between the West and East, as Putin claimed?
I think that we can answer that question quite simply, but let's go by degrees. Number one, Turkey controls the access to the Black Sea. So that, by definition, puts Turkey in a position whereby it cannot not be part of the negotiating team. Secondly, there are actually very few alternatives. How could the United States of America possibly sit down at the table to negotiate some form of agreement with Russia? Out of the question. The European Union is far too disorganized. The European Union doesn't have clear ideas. And that leads us to the third major player, which is Turkey, where we have President Erdogan, who has extremely clear ideas, who has enormous foreign policy objectives, who is actually, with every passing day, being more and more successful with his foreign policy objectives. Turkey is present in a very, very convincing manner in a great number of African countries, for example. And a great number of these countries are countries that desperately need grain, they desperately need greater food security, they desperately need food to be exiting the Black Sea from both Russia and Ukraine. So the logical answer is Turkey, because Turkey is probably the only country in a position to act as a credible negotiator. On the one hand, it resolves other people's problems, and on the other hand, it resolves some of its own questions and problems in terms of foreign policy and in terms of international credibility. So basically, why is Turkey involved? Because Turkey is probably the only credible player that could possibly have any form of influence in these negotiations.
Mm-hmm. Very good indeed. Thank you so much for this explanation. In the same context, the U.S. top diplomats urged the Kremlin to accept substantial proposal that Washington has put forward to secure the release of 2 Americans detained in Russia.
We put a substantial proposal on the table weeks ago to facilitate their release. Our governments have communicated repeatedly and directly on that proposal.
Mr. Solovyan, there is a speculation that the U.S. is seeking to swap Wheeland and Qnat for Russian arms dealer Victor Bout, who is serving 25 years sentence in Illinois. Do you really think that U.S. now is looking also for its own interests, and Russia has now the bigger hand of negotiation? It's been 6 months since the war started. All the time, no one wanted to negotiate. Now, they are all trying to share a table of negotiations. Are these signs of a breakthrough, and who is winning directly?
From my point of view, these negotiations, this contact between Blinken and Lavrov is not a breakthrough in terms of finding any solution in Ukraine-Russian war, because there is still lack of confidence and reliability between Russians and United States, as well as between Ukraine and Russia. And even if some undercovered deal will be reached between United States and Russia, which I not believe, United States doesn't have any possibility to fulfill such agreements without Ukrainian authorities. And the Ukrainian authorities is dependent on public view. I mean, until Ukrainian society will not accept any solution of the war, these agreements cannot be achieved and fulfilled. That was originally a mistake of Kremlin in their attempts to push on Europeans because Kremlin thought that in such a way they could bring Kiev to some negotiations and make Kiev to fulfill Minsk agreements. But that was a mistake because the West didn't have such a toolkit of impact on Ukrainian authorities, and Ukrainian authorities also understood that that would be their last decision to fulfill such agreements without any coordination with Ukrainian society.
Perfect. Now let's tackle another topic before we reach the end of our discussion. The Russian gas giant Gazprom said on Saturday that it has stopped deliveries to Latvia, saying that the Baltic nation has violated the terms of gas extraction. Latvia refused to comply with Moscow's ruble payments demanded, which insists that European countries wish to pay in for gas in rubles. In the same context, Gazprom Deputy CEO Vitaly Merkelov said Siemens failed to return the Nord Stream gas turbine to Russia on time after a mandatory repair.
The time between overhauls for Siemens engines is 25,000 hours. After that, a mandatory overhaul in the factory is required. In December last year, Siemens engine number 073 was delivered to a factory in Canada for repair. We expected to get it back in May. This engine has not returned to Russia so far, due to anti-Russian sanctions and without the consent of Gazprom. It was sent from Canada not to Russia, but to Germany.
Mr. Mark, Russia has cut the amount of the natural gas it sends to Europe by closing down a turbine on the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. Critics accuses the Russian government of using gas as a political weapon. So, to this point, what can Europe do? I mean, how is Europe reacting to the supply cuts, and what is the alternative?
Well, yes, gas is being used as a weapon. Of course it is, and this was only logical. You use the power that you have, and gas is an enormously powerful weapon for Russia, because most of Europe depends upon Russian gas. What are the alternatives? The alternatives are to increase supplies from, for example, Algeria. If we take a look at the last few weeks, we've had a number of visits to Algiers. I cite, for example, the Italian visit. Very, very important. The only little problem is that while gas exports from, for example, Algeria towards Europe can be increased, it's not something that can be done immediately. There's an enormous difference between oil and gas. Oil can be transported on a ship, it can be transported on a train, it can be transported by road. Gas either flows through a pipeline or it's carried on specific vessels. And there's not a shortage of these vessels, there's a shortage in Europe of the infrastructure that then allows them to unload the gas that they are carrying in liquid form in order that it enters the European gas supply chain. So currently, European nations are running around asking countries, Egypt is another example, to increase gas supplies. So it is an issue of, quite literally, running around and asking favors. There is no alternative. Moscow knows this. Moscow plays this to its best advantage.
Perfect. Mr. Mark Law from Italy, Mr. Volodymyr Solovian from Ukraine, thank you ever so much for participating with us in this debate. We have reached the limited time, so thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here with us on AL24 News. Take care and have a blessed day.